Hello, good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar today, Women in Operations. Today's webinar is sponsored by the GLACUHO Facilities and Operations Committee and the GLACUHO League of Women, GLOW. My name is Jeremy Alexander. I'm the technology coordinator, and I'm hosted at Eastern Illinois University, and I'll serve as the moderator for today's webinar in the back end. For today's webinar, I'd just like to go over a few quick housekeeping items to maximize your learning from this session. To ask questions, please use the QA section. The presenters will answer the questions as quickly as possible, but we want you to make sure that we have enough time to cover all of the materials. Should you experience any technical issues, please type in a chat box and I'll work to assist you through that issue. At the end of the presentation, the audio and video of this recording will be available on glacuho.org under the Webinar Archives resource for your future reference. We encourage you to share this resource with your colleagues who are unable to attend today. At this time, I'll turn it over to our moderator for the afternoon, Danielle.
Perfect. Thank you, Jeremy. So we'll go ahead and get started. All right. So each panelist will have an opportunity to introduce themselves, but so we'll go actually ahead and go to that next, that part of this. So our first question for today is for each of the panelists to introduce ourselves, provide our position and the institution that we are hosted by, as well as a brief summary of our current role. And I'll go ahead and get started for this question. So my name is Danielle Hernandez. I'm the Assistant Director for Facilities at Northern Illinois University. In my role, I oversee the work request office that we have that takes all of our work orders for students and staff in the residence halls. I oversee the staff apartments, all of our security for the buildings, our keys, all of our emotional support animals and other accommodations. And I supervise 2 full-time staff members, 2 graduate assistants, and then at any given time, about 5 to 10 different students. So that's just kind of a nutshell of the various major points that that my area oversees. Becky, if you want to go ahead.
I'm Becky Lanter. I'm the Director of Plant Operations at Xavier University. And my role really supports both our residential areas and the academic, athletic, administrative areas of campus. So I work with our crafts and trades areas, our grounds areas, and our housekeeping areas, a team of just over 50 people total to support our students and our faculty and staff in accomplishing their work.
Thank you. Emily?
Hi, yeah, my name is Emily Lucillus. I am the Housing Services Manager at Eastern Michigan University. Basically, in a nutshell, my role is very similar to what Danielle was mentioning. I am kind of the middleman between our department and the physical plant, helping in daily operations and facilities at our residence halls and on-campus apartments. It is a new position to the campus and to our department. So while I have a list of responsibilities, it is still new and ever changing. I just started the position in December, but I work under the Assistant Director for Residential Services. So I help a lot with ongoing work orders in our residence halls, whether that be for the building in general, for students who have been waiting on work orders, and then key security, making sure all of our student room keys are accounted for and all of their information is safe behind our front desks.
Thank you all. Let's see. The second question for today is, what brought you into housing facilities operations? However you see your role kind of fit into that. So maybe we'll go ahead, Becky, if you want to start with this one.
Yeah, so I sort of came into the work in facilities a little bit sideways. I started my career doing some really technical work in energy management and utilities. So a lot of conversations about electricity and how it gets places and why that matters and those sorts of things. And I did some of that work in public sector, but I also worked in private industry. And then when I really moved into higher ed, that was a spot that I really enjoyed being in. I enjoyed being part of something that was a little bit bigger and maybe a little bit more idealistic than some of the other work I'd done. When I started to work with being able to bring a technical skill set, but also really being able to look at the results of what we were doing and have something that was more mission driven was really important to me in my work. And so this has been a spot that's sort of hit the right note in terms of staying here longer term and being able to feel like we're doing some impactful work. One of the unique things is that, you know, I'm really working with the whole of campus. So you're working with a really diverse array of buildings. We have apartment buildings. We're dealing with people's homes, but we're also dealing with, you know, an office building and a classroom building and an athletic complex. So it's interesting work in that it's really varied. But I think the piece of it that's really I come back to over and over again is this is where people live. You know, our students in choosing to come here are oftentimes choosing to actually be part of our campus in a really impactful way beyond just their work in the classroom.
Thank you. Emily, you can go next.
I typed mine out because mine is kind of a tale. And I apologize, I'm getting over a cold, so I am a little congested too as I speak. But basically, so I work for EMU and I actually worked for the housing department here when I went here for my undergraduate degree. So I worked with housing for a while as an undergraduate student. Basically, after an awesome year as a freshman living on campus in my residence hall and really forming a great bond with the girls on my floor. And my RA was a phenomenal RA who got involved and was really active in making sure we had a good year. I was really encouraged to try to be an RA the following year myself. So I applied and I did not get hired. I was put on the alternate list and I wasn't petty about it, but I went home for the summer. And then randomly in July, I got a call from our on-campus apartments department, which was at the time a separate department from our residence halls. In the future years, they merged, but at this time they were still separate. So I got a call from them in the middle of the summer asking me kind of late minute to join their team. But I said I'd be more than happy to once I found out it included a free apartment to live in. So I hopped onto their team in July that year. And in the summer, I mean, anyone working in housing knows that student employees kind of do the most random projects, whatever's needed at the time. So at the time, there was a group of guys called our student crew who basically did, you know, generic basic work orders in our residence halls and on-campus apartments that you don't necessarily need a facilities maintenance worker. Like, you know, okay, go change this light bulb, you know, basic essentials like that. That summer, one of our apartment buildings were getting a ton of brand new furniture, including brand new mattresses, bed frames, you know, coffee tables, everything. And they were really short staffed. So I was thrown onto the student crew and forced to help them. And through that, you know, I really had to prove myself to this group of guys that I could do it and handle it and you know, be tough enough to hang out with them. And so I did that whole summer. You know, I carried mattresses up the floor. I helped build furniture like I worked for IKEA my whole life. You know, I really proved to the guys like, yep, I'm a woman, but I can do this, I assure you. And so basically that was like my first real step into it was, you know, kind of being forced because they were low staff. You know, fast forward, you know, at the end of that year, my boss came up to me and said, hey, look, you know, you've been great on our staff, but I realized that, you know, ultimately at the end of the day, you are really kind of looking to go into the restaurant industry. I know dining is hiring. Do you want me to put a good word in for you there? You know, I'd love to still have you on the team, but also I want you to have a job that's dedicated towards what you're going for in the career. My undergraduate degree was in hotel and restaurant management. So a lot of the hotel courses that I did take completely coincided to working with housing and residence halls and apartment buildings, hand in hand. But at the end of the day, at that point in time, my dream job was to, own my own restaurant. So I did go work for dining, and it turned out to not be a good fit. So I came back and knocked on my old boss's door and said, listen, I know you hired all your students for this upcoming fall, but just to let you know, I quit my job. I'd love to come back if the opportunity presents itself, just letting you know. And, thank God they liked me and, basically created a position for me and allowed me to come back to the housing department, where from then on, I wasn't an RA, but I basically was an administrative assistant to the director of operations. And basically I worked in the central housing office, and I was one of the few undergraduate students who got the opportunity to do that, aside from, our normal front desk workers. And basically, I really was his assistant, anything he needed help with. And that in turn went into helping put in work orders and helping, follow up on work orders, because he was a busy guy. He just needed help, checking in on these things. So I got involved in that. And so I would put these work orders in, and he would be like, all right, put this work order in that the Sloan valve is leaking. And I'd be like, okay, I did it. What does that mean? And, and they would need escorts to go into rooms, when our FMWs or, any, plumbers, et cetera, would go into rooms, we would have an escort go in with them, so they were never going in alone. I was one of those people. I was really nerdy and annoying, and I was always over their shoulder being like, okay, now what are you doing? What's that part? What are you fixing now? How does this work? And so I just was just that nerd who liked understanding how things worked and, wanted to know, okay, if this is what my job is, I should probably know what I'm talking about. So I started learning through them. My boss saw that I was genuinely interested in it, so he took every opportunity to get me involved with his discussions with the physical plant, to let me in as much as he could tell an undergraduate employee, really try to get me involved as much as he could, because he could tell I was really into it. So much that I ended up taking construction management courses on campus. I basically made up my own minor and took half construction management courses and half general business management courses, because again, I didn't know if I wanted to go into the career with it, but just as a human, you should understand how buildings work, no matter what field you're going into. Even if I wanted to own my own restaurant, I should be able to know how to upkeep my own restaurant. And knowing as a woman that you can easily get taken advantage of because people assume you don't know how those things work, I wanted to make sure I understood what I was talking about. So I took a lot of construction management courses. I did my 30-hour OSHA construction management training. And yeah, ended up doing that just out of general interest. Then I graduated, worked about 4 years for a restaurant management company, and then randomly got a call one day back from housing again, saying, hey, we created a new position, please come back and work for us. So long story, but I did it a little bit as an undergrad student, went on into the real world for a handful of years, and then they convinced me to come back, and I've been happy to be back since.
Thank you. I definitely have some similarities to Emily's story there. I went to undergrad at Northern as well, and I worked at our front desk, so I was very familiar with a lot of the processes that happened. And I feel like it was definitely that eager front desk worker that wanted to know more about how things worked and what happened with the keys and what other people's jobs were. I was pretty involved with our Residence Hall Association, and I served as the assistant president for that. And in that role, I got to work with who eventually became my supervisor, and tried to get different facilities projects put through that the Residence Hall Association supported, and would work with housing to try to get some of those, get those things pushed forward. So when it came time to graduation, I didn't know what I was going to do. I was a sociology undergrad, and so I had applied for a master's program in Soch and the adult and higher education program here at Northern. And when the GA, I was offered a GA ship, and so once that happened, I was kind of like, okay, I'm going to go with that one. There's housing, there's all these things. So I think at that point, you know, I was familiar with the field of student affairs and what that would look like a little bit, because of working with RHA and my I had some friends and things that were going through the program. So I was familiar, but I didn't know if I would stick with it or what that would really look like. But once I got into the grad assistantship, I was then the person that was working with the students in RHA to work on some of those different things that they wanted to get pushed forward. And that was a really unique perspective. Students, I feel like every year they kind of ask for the same things that when I was a student, we also asked for. And so it's just so funny that some of those things never really changed, but I got to see another side of it. And so I wasn't sure at that time if I would continue in facilities or not. But similar to Emily, like as I was working with the work orders and working with the tradesmen and working kind of at this other level, I definitely became very interested in how this all operated, what the budgets looked like, how projects got approved and what those processes looked like. And my boss was very open to letting me get involved. And so during that time, I also got involved in GLACUHO, and I had actually served as a committee member on the Facilities and Operations Committee for a few years during that time. So she would definitely help me get, I think, a lot of the different professional development things that I was looking for as well. Once I went to graduate again, it was kind of like these crossroads, not really sure what I was going to do. I knew I wanted to stay in facilities, but I wasn't sure what that would look like maybe at other institutions and that sort of thing. But there happened to be a job opening for a coordinator role on the facilities team. And so I applied and I moved into that role. And then a few years passed by and there was an opening for the assistant director role. And then I was able to move into that role. That was about 4 years ago. And right after I started, my supervisor at that time was offered a really unique position still at the institution, but she left and then we never filled that position. So then kind of all of a sudden it was like, figure all of this out and try to figure out all those, things that she was doing at her level that I maybe wasn't quite working on yet. So I feel like the facilities and operations definitely has sort of a unique way of grabbing you in and keeping you there a little bit. And especially if you're interested, like Emily spoke about too, like I have asked like our heating plant if I could come in to see the way that they turn off our valves in the basement and see what those things look like. Because when I'm explaining it to students, I can kind of do it in a way that makes more sense to everybody if I really understand what's happening. And so I've definitely tried to do that. So I think also the people that I work with and kind of serving as that middle person to all these various groups is something that I really like, and that relationship building piece that comes along with it, especially as a woman in this role, so that I am taken seriously. And I know people take what I say as, okay, she's looked into this, she knows what she's talking about, we can trust this, we can move forward with this. And so definitely, as I got brought into this, those became very apparent things that needed to happen and make sure that I was doing. So I think that's also kind of a very similar story. I think a lot of people have something like that. Did anybody have anything just in case that you wanted to add that maybe you thought about? I know as people are talking and as other panelists are talking, I kind of like, oh, I forgot about this, or thinking about other things. So if anybody has anything to add, I can.
I just had written down here to mention that, like I said, I am very new professionally into this role, so it's unique, and I almost feel like not worthy to be speaking on this panel right now. But I had written down on here that Yeah, I just actually started professionally in this career in December, so I haven't even been a year into it, but also that's why I don't have any headshots right now. And I just signed up for GLACUHO, and I was nervous because I just registered on Friday and everything. So I'm very new into the professional side of things and excited to be here.
Thank you. Yes, definitely. And you are definitely worthy of being here. So it's very exciting and definitely a unique situation. Let's see. Go ahead and move on to question 3. And we kind of maybe have touched on this a little bit. What challenges do you face as a woman in operations? Emily, would you want to start?
Absolutely. So this one is not going to be as long of a response. But I mean, the challenges I face are so typical. I mean, you know, it's the standard. Men are going to assume you don't know what you're talking about, and they assume that if they're having a conversation relating to plumbing or heating in a building, that it's just going to go right over your head. So it's annoying and frustrating. And you know, again, I'll go back to I'm brand new in this field. So I think they also look at me and see that I'm still very young and still very new. So, you know, they don't think I can handle it yet. So I'm still very much, you know, every day trying to prove myself, you know, yes, I can. But I also am, you know, very thankful that we live in a world we live in today where even if I don't know something, I'm going to write it down and, you know, thank God for YouTube or, you know, the internet in general. If I don't understand something, I assure you I can figure it out and find a resource on how to comprehend it and understand to know what you're talking about. And I think that people underestimate that if you do the research on your own and actually care enough, like, you can be a part of these conversations and you can be a part of the change and an active participant who's, you know, can actually give you some intellectual input on the conversation. So it's just the stereotypical, you know, men just assuming that this is not your field, this is not your area of expertise. So
Thank you. Becky?
I have not been at Xavier very long at all. And our director of housing was one of the folks who interviewed me. And she asked specifically about this. And it was one of those interactions that, you know, the person who initiated it may not even remember. But when you're interviewing for a position, you remember a lot more of that than the folks who take part in those all the time. But she asked about this specifically, and it's really interesting because the maintenance side of facility operations and of physical plant work is very heavily male dominated. And so stepping into that work, I've been managing primarily men who are older than me, not by an insignificant number of years oftentimes. You know, the part of my group managing and working with our custodial staff tends to skew differently in terms of demographics, but there's always been sort of an interesting play there where I'm more conscious of that perhaps than I was before I took on some of these leadership roles. And I think one of the big challenges, you all pointed to this, was really proving that you understand what you should understand. You know, when I was asked about this in my interview, I said, well, I guess the best thing I can say, my educational background's in engineering, right? So thankfully, I didn't walk into this in the work world and suddenly be surprised that I was the only woman in this meeting, and that's happening over and over. That happened much earlier on, right? When you're looking around physics and engineering classes, and that was the initial experience of that. And I'm really grateful that I had that experience before beginning my professional life, because I think it would have been more difficult to be on that learning curve in the workplace than it was while I was still working on my degree. I think here it's a lot about that balance of knowing what I know and knowing the skill sets I bring to the table, and balancing that with understanding and valuing the skill sets of our building technicians, especially because you often have folks who have real depth of expertise and real institutional knowledge. There's always somebody on the maintenance team who's, the person who's been caring for this building for 32 years since we built it, and he can tell you the whole story of why this thing is the way it is that makes no sense if you come into it. And so it's really starting to navigate that challenge of there are times that I'm going to need to make a decision that's going to be unpopular. There are times that I'm going to ask questions. And it's really, for me, I think the fact that I have to spend a lot more time thinking about the way in which I ask those questions. And it's not that I do different work, it's that there's an onus on me to approach my work differently because I'm a woman than there would be if it were a man doing this work.
Thank you. I feel like I see us all kind of nodding our heads at various points. That it seems like there's definitely some very similar situations. For me, I think the only thing I would maybe add is I think it is definitely about that credibility and trying to figure out what that looks like for maybe these various audiences too. So it might look different for me specifically. We have a physical plant, a heating plant, and then like our building services would be those three main areas. And so based on the individuals, I'm also maybe going to change the way that I ask the same question. So it is definitely a lot of extra energy to make sure that those things are happening. I feel like I also spend way more time crafting emails than I probably would need to, just to make sure everybody kind of understands what's happening. So for me, instead of having, I feel like it's just really important to me to make sure everything is there already. So I'm not being asked questions. So trying to anticipate what those questions might be before I even get them. I think another challenge, Becky, you sort of alluded to this as well, as we have these individuals on campus that know the insides and outs of these buildings. And for us too, we have lots of individuals who are getting near retirement. And so what can I do, and what would my role be in trying to figure out how we can have all this written down, because it's not. And what is that going to look like when we are going to have to replace these individuals and we don't have that institutional knowledge anymore. And when I've started to bring up some of these questions, I have been challenged a little bit, like kind of why, and it's mostly because I want to make sure, for me specifically, the residence halls, I want to make sure our students are served the best that they can be. I think especially right now, with all of the supply chain shortages and lots of things that we're anticipating and that keep happening, all the information that we can have, the more the better. So those are definitely, I think, the main challenges. It just sounds like we're all having to do a little bit more work than maybe we would need to be prepared for these situations. So let's see, if there's not anything to add, I can go ahead to question 4. And we can always circle back at the end as well if anybody has anything. What does care and concern look like for you in your role, and what does it look like for students? Let's see, Becky, we want to start?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I think one of the things that I really strive to do well is to work with the folks in the residence halls, and just like working on or talking about, the balance between sort of the formal education and then the real earned on the ground experience of the technicians, there's a different knowledge base and a different skill set on the facility side of things than there sometimes is on the housing side of things. And so understanding how we support our colleagues in other areas in their dealings with students. I think a lot about the differences in the interactions my team is often the people most intimately, the professional staff maybe most intimately in a student's living space. They have those sort of touch points where somebody's coming in for a specific purpose. And every place I've been has a really robust RA program that seeks to provide them some support in that residential setting. But I marvel time and again at the relationships that are built between the students and the custodial staff, or the students and the maintenance staff. And in large part, I think it's because they're there. It's such a consistent presence in such a different way than somebody that they see in an academic setting, or something like that. And so I think for me, my piece in that is to make sure I'm equipping my team with the information they need to do that well, and to do that, to know what to look for, to know how to engage folks in other areas of student affairs when things really are out of our depth. So, when is it appropriate to just sort of give an encouraging word to a student versus when we need to recognize there's something that requires more attention and expertise than we have to offer here. And so I see things where, people just mention things, right? Making sure if a custodian or a building technician is mentioning a problem to me, that I follow through on that I make sure they know what the appropriate avenues are. And oftentimes that is just to talk to me or another member of the management team, but to make sure that that's clear to them. The last thing I want is for somebody who sees a problem or is concerned about a student to not know what to do with that information. At the same time, I have a different view of this just because I am a woman, and being able to explain to our technicians how some of these things are experienced by somebody else, right? So it's typically very sort of mundane things, but I think about over our break, we had an extended winter break like a lot of places did, trying to manage the implications of COVID. And we did a decent job of communicating what work was going to happen in the halls in specific cases, but we really didn't. There were things we take for granted. We test fire alarms over this time period every year. We have forever. It didn't occur to us to talk about that in a different way because of the break. And then my team really couldn't conceptualize, well, I was in here, I was working, nobody was around. I was out in the hallway testing, the sprinkler system. Why does it matter? I didn't shut off their water. I would have told somebody. And to be able to explain from sort of I'm not relaying what somebody else is going to tell you. I can say, hey, if I'm a woman and I'm one of 3 people in this building right now, and I hear somebody tromping around, it's creepy. I don't know who you are or if you're supposed to be there. And what do I do then? Do I come out of my room to see what this is about? Because that's not always a great move. Or, do I call somebody and then it feels like an overreaction if I call campus police and they come in and find a maintenance van there? So to help my team understand to the extent I can how this, maybe their intentions and the experiences of students don't always align, and how we can make some adjustments to our practices and our approaches that are really impactful to students and to their experience here in making them feel comfortable in their housing environment.
Thank you. That's great. Emily, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I would just like to second Becky's sentiments in saying that I do think it's really important to make those connections with your custodian staff in the buildings and, people that aren't necessarily a part of the housing department, but who are still actively engaged in making sure, the buildings that your students are living in are, you know, maintained and successful. So I think reaching out and showing your appreciation and, you know, making those small moves and making those significant but small steps just to say, hey, I see what you're doing and I care and thank you. You know, talking to our FMWs, talking to our foremen and tradesmen in specific areas where, like, hey, I know I have to ask you this and it's frustrating for you. And I just want you to know I recognize that and I really appreciate the work you do. You know, small things like that really make a huge effort and impact in how every department kind of works together throughout the whole year cohesively. And so I always encourage my graduate students to reach out to our custodian staff and say hi and, you know their names, acknowledge them. You know, if it saddens me so much when a custodian comes through to change the trash in our office and someone, you know, acts as if they're just a fly on the wall, and or if the custodian feels that way too and they feel like they can't even say hi. Like, you know, we're all humans. You, just because your role is different than mine doesn't mean it holds any less value. Like, you're a huge part in maintaining this building with us. And, you know, again, just show that you care and appreciate and acknowledge them. And that's all they want. That's all they ask for. It helps a long way. I also think, you know, care and concern for me, doing everything you can, you know, even little things to show that you care about the buildings you're responsible for. I like Becky said earlier in our conversations, you know, at the end of the day, remember that these are buildings that students are living in, you know, 8 months out of the year. These are where they're sleeping every night. You know, this is their home for them. So, you know, I tell my graduate students when they're walking through our halls, you know, I say, I want you to look at various projects from two different aspects. One, I want you to look at it from a business standpoint and try to make a decision ultimately that is best for the business. But also, I want you to look through it from a student's eyes and tell me from a student standpoint, hey, if this was your room for the rest of the year and you were walking into this, how would you feel? How do you feel about the furniture in here? How do you feel about the cleanliness of this building? Like, I want your input from a student's perspective as well, because at the end of the day, that's what this job is about. It's about caring and fostering to them and making sure that their experience while they're here is the best it could possibly be. And that's even like the little things. I know, you know, no one's budget is as big as they wish it could be. So even the small things from doing rounds every day and being like, oh, okay, that light bulb's burnt out. Oop, we need a new jelly jar outside of this building. So, you know, like, just doing the small things we can and saying, oh, you know what, maybe we should really, you know, high dust the fan blades in our lounges because they're looking a little, you know, subpar, and, you know, our students might be seeing this. And, you know, one of my favorite things about my job is, yes, a lot of the time I'm just responding to emails, but I like that I can be active. And, you know, part of my job is just walking through our buildings and looking at it, trying to, you know, from a brand new perspective, from open eyes, saying, okay, if I was a new student or if I was a parent coming on campus and seeing this building, and what helps is that I am kind of new again to this role in this campus. So I am kind of seeing it. While I saw it a long time ago when I worked as an undergrad student, a lot of this is new and things have changed since the last time I've been here. So I can kind of look at it from that perspective. And I think, you know, just when you show that you care about your building, I think it encourages the students residing in them to do the same. So I think part of our job, I wrote it down, is, you know, what I love about working for housing is that you motivate the students to care. And, you know, your job is really to help foster a community focused environment. You know, again, as someone who lived here on campus as a student, my freshman year was incredible because of my RA specifically, and because of the, you know, housing staff that worked in my building and the little things they did to make us enjoy living there and want to care and create that community with the girls on my floor. So I think it's really important for us to show that we care, even from doing the small steps and, you know, walking through and doing rounds in our buildings to make sure we're, you know, finding the little things that could use attention that may be being overlooked, you know, every day. And, you know, trying to take pride in where you work and, you know, fostering a sense of pride for students and where they live as well.
Thank you. I definitely agree with both of you on everything you said. I think for me, and thinking of maybe more of like a COVID or like a crisis management perspective, I think care and concern for me kind of shifted a little bit. So for example, when there is like a major crisis situation that is happening, I serve on a duty rotation. So while I am in housing, I don't report to residents live. I report directly to the director of housing. So we've done a lot of work over the last several years to get kind of even those silos within our own department kind of tried to get rid of some of those. So for me, with serving on this duty rotation, I can see that the care and concern of our after hours heating plant, our physical plant employees, all of those people, when we have a major event, I can tell that they care. And I try to do things to make sure that that is highlighted to our housing staff that are working in the halls. Because I think sometimes there's this disconnect and maybe a lack of transparency that really could exist. So everybody kind of knows what everybody's role is and how those all work together. And when everybody's not doing what they need to be doing, that sometimes that's where we have issues where maybe we miss something with the student's room or those sorts of things. So I think for me, it also is like mentioned, appreciation for kind of some of those individuals or individual areas that maybe aren't thought of like they are contributing to fostering an environment for our students that creates a sense of belonging. So for me, that's one of my biggest things in my role is I want to make sure our students feel comfortable where they're living and make sure that they are able to learn in their space and try to figure out what that looks like for them. And so when we have major disruptions or, like was mentioned about like fire drills, or when you're changing some of those things, just making sure I'm transparent with everybody who's involved so that and that people understand why we do these things and why we have to do these things. Because I think that's a part of it too. Just this thing that happens every year and no one loves it, but here's why we have to do it. And really it is important. And here's all the reasons. So just making sure that that is being shared, I think also gets some of that buy-in from others too. I think in terms of our students, I think it's making sure that we're doing kind of the follow-up and that we're checking in and making sure and kind of like working with our hall staff. So one of the things that my area implemented is we get our weekly reports of all of the work orders that were submitted for that building. And so instead of my area just kind of going through those and kind of checking them out, we send it to the full-time staff for those areas so that they can see like, oh, here's all the work orders that were submitted. Oh, I also had a conversation with this student about this and they're managing this and maybe they're failing a class or they have all these other things so that they can see like this student is really being impacted. What can we do to better support them? What's kind of going on? So that's kind of one of my hopes that we'll kind of be able to continue to move towards this more well-rounded view of some of the things our students might be experiencing. So I think for our students sometimes too, they're needy. And so a little bit, I think they just want to know that we do care and that we are trying to get it done. So for me, the biggest care that I can show for them is just making sure that there is that follow-up and that they know what's going on. Specifically if there's an ongoing work order or concern, which we've had a lot of water things this year. So there's been lots of that follow-up. So I think that is all I have. And we'll go ahead to question 5. What advice would you give other women who may be interested in joining or shifting to facilities operations? And I can either go or if one of you wants to go ahead. I think I'll go ahead and start with this one. So for me, I think advice that I would give would be sort of some of the things that we've talked about. I think all of us are probably successful in our roles because we are genuinely interested in what we are doing and making sure that we our understanding, understanding what is going on. So I feel like when you're switching, maybe, and all systems are different too. So, you know, how all of our departments are also, you know, a little bit different. So kind of figuring out what that looks like on the campuses that you're interested in. I think also there are so many processes within like residence life that are driven by operations, whether it's, you know, room checks or some of those other things. So my suggestion would be to reach out to your facilities and operations folks and find out things that would be helpful for you to know, or the things that you could improve upon. Because a lot of times it's a lot of the admin tasks that people don't necessarily want to do, because, you know, hall directors, a lot of times they're getting into this field because they want that interaction with students, and that they want to build relationships with students and make sure students are having a positive experience while they're here. And I think sometimes those admin things, because they happen so frequently and because they're not the fun stuff, they kind of get a little bit left behind. But so really, I think if you are interested in shifting, having those conversations, you can understand kind of where facilities and operations is coming from. And so you can better understand ways you can maybe even implement that in your own job. The other thing I would say too is, you know, you don't have to have, you don't have to know what a standpipe is to join, you know, facilities. You'll learn it eventually, or things similar, but you don't necessarily need to know those things. So don't let that intimidate you from taking, you know, that leap specifically into, you know, facilities. You'll learn those things. So it's more about highlighting those transferable skills that you have, that you can do this job. You can, you know, build relationships, communicate effectively, and kind of more focusing on those things. Let's see, Becky, do you have anything?
Yeah, I think some of the best advice I've gotten when I moved into leadership in the facilities management side of things was, you don't have to lead like somebody else does to be leading successfully. And I think that goes for some of this conversation about how we care for our students. The way in which my custodians or my maintenance technicians on my team caring for students isn't going to look the same as when somebody in a different area of campus is caring for them. And that's okay, right? So to emphasize that, I think the other, you know, I think about the fact that there are skill sets that I bring to this work and that other women bring to this work that I think can be undervalued until they're seen, right? So everybody thinks they're a good communicator until you have somebody who's actually doing that work of keeping everybody up to date and on the same page. And the difference that makes is huge. So I think to say, you know, there may be concern about the places that the information lacks, or do I have the right skill set? And the answer is maybe there are things you want to learn or need to learn, but there are already things that you know and already things that you do as part of the way you approach your work. And then I think really just, I think sometimes people don't realize how willing to collaborate, to explain, to discuss the folks on the facility side are. People don't ask me enough about standpipes and Sloan valves. So when somebody's willing or even interested in understanding more of the nuts and bolts, and I see that, you know, probably amplified for a lot of our technicians. So for somebody to really come in and say, so tell me why this thing broke, like what happened to it? What does that mean? Is I think sometimes there's a concern that's sort of irritating, or like I'm the person asking all the questions. But what I see is so much engagement from my team when people do that. So I would say don't hesitate if you're on the other side of this to really dig in and to ask the questions, because what I found is either there are people who are willing to explain it and everybody learns something, And if they can't explain it, they may not have a really good answer for you, right? So if they can't explain to you how they fixed it, we're probably going to be fixing that thing again next month. So ask the questions. Like that's completely appropriate, and it's really not. It's not just best for you. It makes the system work better.
Thank you. Emily?
Yeah, I will second that in saying, I think that if there's any woman interested in pursuing facilities or operational management to do it, if you're interested, do it. And, don't be afraid to ask questions, as I learned, because people who recognize that you do have an interest and are genuinely curious and want to learn will appreciate that. And like Becky said, they'll foster that and take the time to do that. And I think it's important to remember that, if you do pursue a career in facilities and go that route, that you too, can be a role model for another female, someone perhaps younger than you, another student working for your department, and be that role model. I was really lucky to work under a lot of people who helped see what my interests were and helped, cater to that and help them grow. And I'm very thankful for the women that I work with in all departments on campus who are truly role models to me as I'm a new young professional working on campus. So I would say if you're interested, do it, because you too can be a role model, not to sound too cheesy. But then like Danielle said, you don't have to know everything. And like I said earlier, the best part about living in today's world is if you don't know how to do something or don't know what someone's talking about, you can Google it. So there's so many times I'm just writing little notes to myself where I'm like, I'm not sure what they were talking about. I'm going to research that later. And then the next day, guess what? I kind of know what you're talking about now. So, don't be scared if it seems overwhelming. You don't have to know every single detail of every single trade, but the more you participate and ask questions that may sound dumb, or join groups of interest and get involved in committees, and as much as you can, just to start learning and start understanding, people will appreciate that and help educate you along the way and help you gain more insight as you go and grow in the field. So if you're interested, do it, because people will respect the hell out of you if you are a woman in the field.
Definitely. One thing that just made me think about too, the team that I serve on, it's all women in our area, which is fairly unique, and it's been that way for quite some time now. So I think there is something to be said about some of us trying to recruit people to also kind of join us. So just think that that's neat. So we are pretty close to the end here. So it looks like, let me check the chat real quick. Okay, Jeremy's just giving us our notes. So at this point, I think what I'll do is open it up. If there, Becky or Emily, if you have any lingering thoughts, anything you want to add, and then we may have time for, we only have about 3 minutes left, so we might have time for one question if anybody has any questions that's participating.
I think one thing from my side, the physical plant folks can be pulled in a lot of different directions. And so I think sometimes there's a habit of, particularly often for a woman in the workplace, to be concerned about but am I bothering them if I ask again? And what I'll say is don't hesitate to do that, especially for the folks on the physical plant side. There are so many competing interests and requests. And so, there's not a week that I don't say to somebody either, yes, I'm still working on that, or that fell off my radar. Let me get back to you. And so don't feel like the squeaky wheel sort of thing. At times you have to advocate for your area, and particularly when that's the students' housing, that matters a great deal.
I think on the opposite end too, I completely agree with everything you just said. I think on the opposite end too, it's also educating your staff, because I do think sometimes they are under the impression physical plant is only working on buildings for housing and residence life. You know, they aren't doing anything else on campus. And sometimes you have to remind them, hey, these plumbers are doing work for us, but they're also in charge of the plumbing for the rest of the entire campus. Hey, I know there's snow on your sidewalk, but guess what? All of campus is covered and it's the same team. So I think also kind of, you know, being that middleman and advocate for the physical plant as well. And, you know, showing them that you're on their team and understanding and trying to educate your staff. Yes, they are working on it, but you need to understand, like, they are working on an entire campus and it's not always just about us sometimes.
Definitely agree with both of those. I think too, just for my situation too, we have aging staff who are lots of retirements and a lot of not replacing those individuals right now. So just having to keep reminding people that there's not only a full campus, but they're also dealing with a lot less people right now that are even available to take care of some of that. Yes, I think that all of that, just again, it sounds like we all sort of are definitely on the same page, and transparency is definitely huge when it comes to that. I don't think we have any, we're right at time actually, but doesn't look like we have any questions. So at this time, on behalf of the Facilities and Operations Committee for GLACUHO, I currently serve as the chair. I suppose I should have mentioned that at the beginning. I would just like to thank Emily and Becky for taking time today to chat with us, and we definitely really appreciate it. Thank you both. And Jeremy, I think if we have no questions, we're probably good.
Yep, just remember you can share the webinar with your colleagues who weren't able to attend. It's on glacuho.org under webinar archives, and hope to continue the conversation and see you at the next session that's tentatively booked for April 25th.
Thank you.
All right, folks, have a good rest of your afternoon.
You too.